What's the most important resource that you have? If you really thought about this deeply, I think you'd come to the same conclusion that Joey and I did. It's time. In our newest book, What's Without Wall Street, the 3 Steps to Financial Freedom Through Passive Income, we talk about how are we tracking that time? What is the thing that we can do to get more of that time back?
That's right. If you've ever been listening to our podcast and thought, man, it would be amazing if I could take all the things that you guys have learned over the last 10 years and just summarize them, put them in some way to easily digest them and take action, that's what this book is all about. You're not going to want to miss it. Go to wealthwithoutwallstreet.com/new book and get your copy today. Wealth Without Wall Street Tribe, get ready to learn all there is about car sharing with our friend Aubrey Janik. Welcome to the show, Aubrey.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, you're in the sharing mode, so I want to have you start off sharing something that maybe not has nothing to do with cars, but I think maybe it leads to your story, which I think is so pivotal, Tribe, that sometimes when we start out as entrepreneurs, we don't always have success. There is lessons that we have to learn. Aubrey, there was a time you walked into a business that you owned and the fire alarm is going off and there's just chaos inside your store. Would you mind sharing that with us and what happened?
Yeah. So back in 2018, I had owned and it's crazy, like to think that 2018 was this long ago. I owned a business, a brick and mortar sandwich shop, and the business had a fire. And so I walked in and the sprinkler system was going off and there had been a fire overnight. And in that process, the business that I owned and really that I had, set the next 10, 20 years on kind of building the framework of opening more locations and then maybe franchising it and then, taking a business to that next level. It was the framework of my life plan. Yeah, it had a fire and it was then kind of the start of the dominoes of my entire career up until that point. Everything that I'd been working towards, it just felt like it had collapsed because it was just, it was devastating. It's hard. For one, I feel like at this point now in 2024, I've almost blocked out a lot of memories from that day to where I don't remember it maybe as much as I should or people would think that I would. But I do remember, in the days and weeks after it happened, I was just sick to my stomach. I was depressed. I've never been more depressed than I was during that period of time. I didn't know what I was going to do. I just feel like the textbook definition of hopeless that I felt starting from that moment that I walked in until really months and months later, where I finally was able to gain clarity from, what happened and what my path would be forward. But hands down, the darkest period of time in my entire life, for sure.
Well, I have the gift of making people go back through those dark times. I apologize to some degree to that, but I think it's one of those things where, as I said at the beginning, as entrepreneurs, sometimes we go through tough times, and there's a difference between what makes us successful as those of us who experience that and continue forward, right?
For sure.
Quitting is when you lose, right? You don't lose until you quit. So you didn't quit, but you mentioned challenges. One of the challenges you shared with Joey and I before we pressed record was that this was one of those things where it was bad enough, the fire was bad enough to where you had to close your doors, but it wasn't so bad that the insurance company was going to immediately kick in and start giving you money. And so now you're staring down a humongous loan payment that you've taken out for this business, but yet you don't have a business. What's going through your mind there?
Oh, it was a complete disaster. It was fortunately, the people that I had surrounded myself almost purely out of luck, the landlord at the time, the bank that I had worked with were all very accommodating, especially the bank. I tried to be just as transparent with them as possible throughout the process. And so I remember as we were liquidating the stuff within the business to try to recoup as much cost, but then of course that never ends up actually paying you as much as you paid for it. And so that kind of chipped away at it slowly. But then it was just kind of a matter of communicating with the bank and being like, hey, I'll figure out a way to pay for this. And then it was just hustle mode from then on out. And it was really, I don't even know truthfully what my mindset was at the point of well, I guess I do know what my mindset was. It wasn't even really a question of am I going to pay this? It's I'm going to pay this and I just have to figure out a way to make it work because the loan was tied to my house. And my house has been in my family since the 1970s. My grandmother owned it, then my dad owned it, then I owned it. And So there was really no, like, not a second of time where I thought, okay, the bank, like, I'll just let the bank take it. It was always just, I got to figure out how the heck I'm going to make this work. And so it was just like hyper focused. Like once I got out of that depression and sorrow hole, it was just a matter of, let's just make this work.
So talk to us about what the next step was. If you had put all this kind of focus on this career and building out the sandwich shop and these locations, what was then the first thing that you tried maybe that led to your current success?
Yeah. So at the time, I was already doing car sharing through Turo. And funny enough, you had mentioned a couple of minutes ago is like sometimes our entrepreneurial failures or downfalls or just tough periods leads to like where you are today. And I had found out about Turo through the marketing guy that I used for the sandwich shop. And so I don't think I would have done it had I not ever met this person. And I met that person because of the sandwich shop. So it kind of like is a full circle thing where ultimately I'm glad it happened, but it was super terrible at the time. But anyways, so I was just in a position to where I was kind of looking at all my options. Like I didn't go to college. So I don't have a degree. I did have a lot of work experience, especially for my age, but I had never worked for a real company. And so I started looking for like work from home jobs, trying to figure out like, okay, maybe I go to corporate America and then also have a side hustle. And ultimately where I landed at was I would end up doing car sharing, which I had already been doing up until that point. I think like at the time that the store had closed, I think I had 2 cars, maybe 3, but I was very early on in that career. And then I had also previously, like years prior in college and whenever I went to college before I dropped out, I did some freelancing stuff. And so I was like, I'm going to go back to freelancing. And so I basically just leaned into freelancing and worked a ton of hours freelancing. I had some part-time stuff that I was working on. And then I also really leaned into car sharing as well. And that's kind of what I dove into. That's what I decided I would stick to.
For those who aren't familiar with car sharing, explain what that is and talk about, some of those first months, years that you were doing that.
Yeah. So car sharing is it's like an Airbnb, but for cars. So instead of you renting out a property, you're renting out a vehicle. And how it works is you have like platforms similar to Airbnb. You have car sharing platforms. The biggest one is a platform called Turo, but there's also ones like Get Around. They also have ones for like RVs. And so there's a handful of options out there, but Turo is definitely the biggest. And that's the one I've predominantly used. And it's the one that I started out with. And so I actually got started with Turo back in 2017. And I got started with it because at the time I had purchased a Jeep Wrangler, like maybe a year, 6 months prior to that. And I really didn't like the Jeep. And so I didn't like driving it. My dogs didn't like it. It was a 2-door Wrangler. And I had gone from a 97 4Runner prior to that. So it was quite a bit different. And I just did not like driving it, but I was kind of stuck with this car that I had bought. And I then talked to my marketing guy who at the time had just purchased a nice Mercedes. And he was like, yeah, I bought it because I'm going to put it on Turo. I'm going to use it while it's not being rented. And so I was like, I'm going to try this with my Jeep. And I remember talking to my boyfriend, now husband, and telling him about the idea. And he was totally against it. He hated it. But I was just like, I'm going to do it. I don't really care what you have to say about it. And so I listed it. It was rented out very, very quickly. And then I vividly remember like at the time being like, this is like a legit thing. Like this is really going to work. And then whenever we had the sandwich shop, and I say my then boyfriend would help with the sandwich shop, but it was technically me that owned it. And so whenever I had the sandwich shop, we would basically put all of the money that I made through the sandwich shop, like my own salary, and then any money that the Jeep made. And then I would just go buy like a cash car. And we just kind of did that a few times. And back then it was also a different car market because you could actually get decent cars for $3,000. Now those days are over, but that's basically how we got started with it.
Yeah. All right. So that's a question. We've talked about Turo on this podcast before. We've shared, the experiences Joey and I have, both good and bad, on that area. I find it interesting that you're choosing your cars based upon your dog's preferences. That's the first for me. That's funny. But, I think one of the questions people are asking, and you kind of just alluded to it, is Turo still a viable, or car sharing, is it still a viable option? Like, because of the prices increasing, have we seen the traditional rental market come back and compete harder than maybe they did before? Talk a little bit about what's happening in the market today as a Turo operator or car share rental operator as maybe compared to, 6 years ago outside of just price?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I think choosing a car based on your dog I think that should be number one. It's like, I'll look at windows. If windows don't roll all the way down, I'm like, my dog's not going to like that. And so it is definitely a top priority. But yeah, so as far as like how it compares is I think that it depends on a few things. Is one, people like Turo, like I guess there's a handful of ways that I could start this is like, one is just the size of the market for Turo versus for like what they were back whenever I began. Is Turo is quite a bit different today than it was back in 2017. And it's different in some good ways. It's different in some bad ways. But I get asked all the time, like, is Turo oversaturated? Is it not a good side hustle to start? And I unequivocally think that the answer is I still think it's great. Because even though there are a lot more hosts, and I think a lot more people are aware, rental car companies are more actively competing, you also have a lot more people who are aware of it as well from a guest perspective. In fact, Turo has grown by, I think, 4 or 5 times since 2021 to today. And that's not even taking into account what it was pre-2021. And so it's just grown a huge amount. And so from that perspective, I think there's a ton of demand with Turo. But then as far as like the pricing and, competing with these rental car companies, I am a big believer that it's all about finding your edge against the rental car companies. And so I think if you're going to rent out a bunch of, Toyota Corollas, Kias, Hyundais that are new 2023, 2024 models, I think that it's a really solid way to fail quickly, because it's just the depreciation is going to kill you. You're not going to be able to match the price. But you find your niche outside of that, and I think you can really make it work, is whether that is, offering 24/7 availability, offering delivery, having, my business model where I rent out cheaper cars. And so my customer base is typically people that either don't qualify for rental car companies or they just can't afford it, or they want the ease and accessibility of 24/7 availability. There's just a lot of ways that I think Turo hosts can position themselves to be better, truly better than a normal car rental company, that I think it does make a lot of sense, but it depends on, your strategy with it. There's definitely ways to fail against car rental companies.
Okay, Aubrey, I have to just be the dumbest one in the room, which is hard to do with Russ in the room with us. But you mentioned something about somebody that doesn't qualify for the rental car companies, but yet you're willing to rent to them for a reason. Help me understand, one, what would keep them from being rentable, and then two, why you would then focus on providing rentals to that person. What risk are you taking on by doing that?
Yeah, so the biggest qualifier is going to be credit cards. And so most rental car companies do require a credit card. And there might be some nowadays that don't, but the majority of them do, and Turo doesn't. And so people do have the ability to use Turo with like a preloaded debit card, a regular debit card. There's just other alternatives to it rather than getting a proper credit card. And so there's also the ability to like book on the extensions are very easy. And so we have like a lot of guests with our cars that will keep our cars for 30, 60. We have one guest that's had one of our cars since June of last year. And she just extends every couple of days. And so there's kind of that accommodation to people that are just maybe don't have the funds for a proper rental car, that are, I think, more accommodating for Turo versus through like a Hertz or an Enterprise, where the extensions aren't as flexible and you don't have communication directly with the guest. And, in the case of like our renter who's had the car since June, we actually will like meet up with her every month or so, change the oil, check the car. That's not going to happen with Hertz or Enterprise. And so that's, I think, one benefit is like there's just benefits to going with Turo for somebody who may not be able to go with a large scale rental company. And as far as why we're comfortable with it, is a lot of Turo is just a matter of decreasing your liability. And that really comes down to reading the terms of service. And so Turo has a terms of service. It's quite long, but it's a pretty easy read. And it goes through everything that you have to do as a host to make sure that you're protected in case something bad happens. And so for us, we follow that to a T. And I say it's my husband actually quit his job back in 2021 to work for our fleet full time. So if I say we, I'm referencing myself and my husband. So we will follow the Turo terms of service to a T. And that way, if something does go wrong, we are protected. And there are, of course, times where we have to eat costs on things. Like, I'm not saying there's no downside. There definitely is. But it really makes it so that your downside is limited, which is one of the reasons why I don't do direct rentals. I get asked frequently, like, hey, if you're doing so well on Turo, why don't you do direct? And for me, having the safety net of Turo is a big, big benefit. And so as long as you follow the terms of service, you kind of retain that safety net.
So talk a little bit, you mentioned you and your husband are running your fleet. How many cars do you have? What does that look like on a daily basis for you and your husband? What is your active involvement in it? Because that's, I think, for somebody who's thinking about a side hustle, and this is probably what most people start out, that's where you started out, was in a side hustle position. How active are they going to be? How much time are they going to put in? What is that going to look like? And then we can maybe start talking about maybe some of the income, the rental, number of nights you're getting on, or number of days you're getting on a typical car. What are the best cars, that kind of stuff. But talk a little bit about how you're set up right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently we have myself, my husband, and we also have a part-time employee as well that helps with the fleet. The part-time employee is very part-time. He typically is 10 to 15 hours. And then at this point in time with the fleet, I'm very much admin. I do not work anywhere close to full-time on the fleet. And so my responsibility is like the books. I'll do our accounting. I'll help with the messaging of guests, handle disputes, claims, pretty much anything that takes place at the desk is stuff that I'll handle. And then my husband is really like the head of operations at this point. And so the question of like how passive or what are the roles of a Turo host, it really depends on the number of cars. And so we have 28 cars at the moment. We gave one to my husband's grandma and then we had a total loss. So we were at 30, we're now down to 28. And so back in 2021, whenever my husband quit his job, prior to that, he was working at a dealership. He's a big car guy. And so it does make a difference, like in our operation, the fact that he loves cars. But I was working up until 21, I was managing our fleet. I had started my YouTube channel. I was doing consulting work. I was also doing freelancing. And so I was pretty jam-packed and I was still able to manage the fleet pretty efficiently up until 12 cars by myself. Once we got to 12 cars is whenever we started noticing that, okay, like this is getting too much. The cars are sitting for too long. And occasionally my husband would help when he was home from work or if he was off on the weekend. Like it's not like he was totally not involved, but he was at a dealership, so he wasn't really able to help a ton. And so that's whenever I realized that like, okay, Turo is no longer this thing that can work at just 10 hours a week. I think that whenever you have 10 cars or less, or really like a dozen cars or less, it's very, very part-time. And I think that at that level of vehicles, it's very semi-passive. Like you could go a couple of days where you don't really have a ton to do. You might have one day where you have to check in 1 or 2 cars, which might take 30 minutes. It's very easy to do. But once you start getting past that, especially if you have another job or other things that you're working on, it does become more difficult to manage all of those things. And you sort of have to adjust your schedule. And the way that people go about kind of handling that, I think, is different depending on how they operate their fleet. And so, for example, my husband is a big car guy. He loves cars. He's a very talented mechanic. So we actually do all of our maintenance and repairs in-house. And that definitely makes our business model less passive but it is more profitable because we do everything in-house except very intense repairs. Other than that, we'll do the majority of stuff. But I know a lot of hosts who have large fleets that don't do any of their maintenance. In fact, I'm good friends with the second largest host in the United States, and he doesn't ever do maintenance. And so he just delegates it all out. He has people coming to him. He has people, taking cars. And so that makes it a lot easier to handle the maintenance. And so it's sort of a sliding scale depending on your involvement of each process. And so for us, we spend our days like, for example, on the weekends, there's not a whole lot to do because cars for us typically get booked out Thursday or Friday for the weekend, and then they'll get returned on Monday. But the majority of the day is spent either cleaning, taking photos of cars, fixing cars. And I would say between myself, my husband, and our part-time employee, it's probably a full-time job, so 40 hours a week, like cumulatively with us all.
If you've listened to our show for any length of time, you've heard us talk about infinite banking and how we are able to use that concept to create over $50,000 a month in passive income. But it's just not that easy to figure out, how does this all connect into my own personal system?
Stallion, that's why we created the passive income operating system, bro. It shows you how to turn active income into passive income. It makes all the steps come together. If you would like to get access to it as a podcast listener, we've never given this away in public before, go to what'swhatwallstreet.com/PIOS. There was nothing worse than walking into class when you're in school and the teacher saying, pop quiz day. Why? Because you were unprepared. Are you unprepared though for financial freedom?
Don't be. Find out how close you are by taking our 30-second quiz at wealthwithoutwallstreet.com/quiz.
All right, so show me the money. That's what somebody who's riding down the road right now is saying. Show me the money. I'm in a car. How can I turn this car into making money? What's the opportunity for somebody?
I mean, I think the opportunity is huge. And the context of the money really depends on what type of car you buy. And this is a topic that I could probably talk about for hours. And so if I go on for too long, feel free to cut me off. But this is where I think that with Turo, it's so important on what type of car you buy. Because you could buy, I think a lot of people, whenever they start Turo, they say, okay, I'm going to go out and I'm going to buy a 2024 model, whatever. And that's how you are successful with Turo. Whereas what I always preach is you have to look at it from an ROI perspective. How much is this car going to rent per day versus how much is this car costing you to buy? And what I have found so often is that if you buy a new, let's say 2024 Camry, that car might cost 30 grand, but that car is only going to rent for maybe $40 a day, 45. Whereas if you get a, 2013, 2014 Camry, that car is going to cost you maybe 12 grand and it's going to rent for $40. So it's going to rent almost identically to a much newer, much more expensive model. And that's pretty much across the board. And so, of course, there's exceptions like high-end luxury, exotic. There are some newer cars that are just more expensive. But you have to pay a lot of attention to what type of car you buy and how much that car costs and how much it can make. And so for us, our sweet spot is cars that cost us anywhere between 5 to 7 grand, if not lower, if we can get them. And typically our cars, we aim for them to make about $1,200 gross per month. And because of the fact that maintenance, repairs, insurance are pretty cheap, maintenance can get a lot depending on like how old the car is. But for the most part, we'd like to be able to net at the end of the month about 800. And so that's typically our goal. And for the most part, our fleet does end up reaching that. And if we end up seeing that a car isn't reaching that, then we will end up selling it or doing something different with it.
Okay, so based on what you just said, a $5,000 to $7,000 car, like one, I didn't even know that they still sold cars that inexpensively, but immediately my brain goes to how many months before something major happens, maintenance-wise, that wipes away all the profits from the previous 3 months, 6 months, whatever the case may be, because I see the benefit of, the ROI is based on, hey, I only put $5 grand into it and I can get that money back within, 6 months based on what you're saying, but only if it continues to work, right?
Yeah.
If it totally breaks down, then it was not worth it. So walk me through, what sort of things maybe do you look for in an older car, or is there certain types of older cars that meet that kind of that point?
Yeah.
Like, this one will work well. Help me understand all those things.
100%. And it goes down to like the Turo is you win or lose a Turo at the start. Like the second that you buy your car is whenever you end up either winning or losing long term. And for us, we have our list of cars that we look for so niche, like it's ridiculous. There are so many cars that we don't buy. And truthfully, if it was up to me, I probably would buy a lot more, but my husband blacklists them. And ultimately he has the final say on cars we buy. But for the most part, we'll buy any Toyota. Toyotas are amazing. And we have a lot of Toyotas in our fleet that we've owned for 5 years, 6 years that have had very minimal maintenance. Like it just pretty much tires, oil, and the occasional maybe $100 or $200 part. And we have a number of cars like that in our fleet that have just been bulletproof. And so we will buy any Toyota. For a long time, we bought Ford Focuses, but we no longer do because 2012 model Ford Focus has changed the engine, so they're no longer reliable. We'll buy Ford Escapes up until 2012 because in 2013 they changed them. We love Mazdas. We'll buy Mazdas all day long. We just actually bought a Mazda a couple weeks ago for $4,300, so it was super cheap. So we'll buy any type of Mazda, but that's pretty much it. We'll buy some Hyundais and Kias depending on the warranty situation and the recall, because there's a circulating recall with Hyundais and Kias, not Kias, just Hyundais. There's a circulating recall issue that can be a problem, and so it really depends on the VIN. And so we are ultra picky about the cars that we buy. And I think your point is 100% hitting the nail on the head, is if you buy a car that isn't reliable, you're going to make a lot gross and net short term, but that car is going to be a huge headache eventually, because the reality is there are a lot of cars that are crap whenever they're a 2012, 2013, but there are a lot of really stout, really solid cars as well. And it's just a matter of, looking for those cars. And so we will do a pretty in-depth pre-purchase inspection. We'll bring out our scanner, look at the car. We'll look for evidence of oil leaks, of maybe things where the person who's selling the car was trying to hunt down a problem and they were never able to fix it. It's a strenuous process. Like I always tell people, we don't have only 28 cars because we can't buy more cars. It's because there's just so much junk out there that we buy cars whenever we see them, but it's hard to find good cars and you just really have to be patient.
And you found your niche is in the smaller, like, compact, intermediate size car range. And it sounds like, your renter is you probably got that down too, right? I mean, who's your typical renter? What are they renting for? How much, how many miles are they putting on the car? But maybe that doesn't even matter. I don't know. If you're buying cars this old, you're not even worried necessarily about the depreciation, because if you rent them for a couple of years anyway, if you bought them for $4,300, how much are you really going to sell them for at the end?
Yeah, 100%. And so and just to the point of the depreciation is, so a big other thing that I always talk about is buying cars below market value. Like, and this is applicable regardless of the type of car you buy, whether it's a cheap car or a more expensive car. Like we do have a Lincoln Navigator in our fleet, like randomly, and because we wanted to get a large SUV for tax reasons. And so we ended up getting that. And so that's kind of the one oddball of our fleet. But we years ago owned a Maserati Ghibli that we purchased for, I think it was 31, maybe 30. And then it ended up getting totaled a few months later. And we were paid out $33,000 for that because we bought it below market value. And that's just an example. But we buy cars, like if their KBB value at $5,000, we'll try to buy that car at $4,000. And then whenever that car ends up, end up needing to sell it, or if it gets totaled, we typically will end up actually making money on that total loss, and we don't even have to deal with depreciation at all because we buy the car at the right price. Like we just had a Toyota Yaris get totaled in March, and we had paid $5,300 for the car back in 2022, and we were paid $6,500 for it whenever it was totaled out. And so we actually made $1,200 on the car itself. But then as far as the type of customer, the majority of our customers are people who need a car. They either don't have one, their car is in the shop, they're in an accident and they just temporarily don't have one. Maybe they just typically don't have a car and they just need one because they're, for whatever reason, they're having to drive further. Since I'm in Dallas, our public transportation is just horrendous. And so you really have to have a car. And so a lot of people who, for whatever reason, don't have one, they'll turn to Turo hosts like myself who just kind of have budget vehicles. And so as a result, it's probably a 50-50 split where we do have guests that drive, 150, 200 miles per day on average, but we have a lot that just drive 10, 20 miles a day as well.
So you mentioned being in Dallas, obviously big city, right? What is it? Like, what if I'm listening to you and I'm in a smaller city? I mean, Birmingham is obviously a bigger, smaller city, but if I'm in a little town of 25,000 to 100,000 people, is Turo and this car sharing an opportunity for me, or do I really need to be in a more metropolitan area?
I don't think you do. I mean, I think that if you were in a smaller market, I definitely would scale cautiously. I wouldn't go into the market, with 10 or 20 cars. I think that would be a mistake. But I do think that because this business model is targeting local people in your community, I think that there's potential with the majority of cities in the country. Obviously, there probably is a limit to that. If you have a city of 500 people or 1,000, that might not be true. But I think that a lot of people are surprised at how much of a reach you could have as a Turo host. Like, for example, in Dallas, I'm actually north of Dallas, so I'm about 30 minutes north of Dallas, and we have people from all over the Metroplex coming and renting our cars. And people will Uber 20 minutes to us, even if it means that they have to pass 10 other Turo hosts who also have cars on the way to getting to us, and they simply went with us because we were cheaper. But like if they accounted for the Uber costs and all that stuff, it wouldn't have been cheaper after all. And so it's just kind of this interesting thing that I always am surprised at is how many people will drive quite far to get to us and just how many locals come to us. And I think that local aspect of the business is just fundamental to then be able to scale this in smaller markets as well. And we've seen it happen where people have fleets in smaller cities. Like there's a host that I know quite well that's outside of Oklahoma City, but he's far enough away to where he's not getting a ton of Oklahoma City business, and it's a smaller town and he does very well. And so you see this quite often, or I know I've seen this quite often, where people are in smaller secondary markets and still do extremely well.
Aubrey, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, this has been amazing to hear how you guys have built this empire, how you created strategies that are meeting the market need where you're at, and you're doing it at the highest ROI that you can possibly do it. There's like a million more questions that I know that I have, and Russ is over there and he looks kind of confused, but that's his normal look. Just to let you know. Talk about your course, because for people that have been listening like we have, they want to know things that we haven't even asked. And I know you've built this course. You've sold over 1,000, I think, of these. You've had that many students. Talk a little bit about what's in the course and what people can expect from it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Carsharing Masterclass is my course, and what I've basically created is a full A to Z guide on how to do exactly what I've done. And over the years, I've actually updated to where it's no longer just my business model. There are some secondary business models that we explore in it. But throughout the course, you'll learn things like the different business models to pursue. For example, whether you want to go my route of buying kind of low end or lower end, I should say, cash cars, or if you want to do a different strategy, where one strategy that's been taking off something called other people's cars, or OPC, or investor cars. And so we actually go through the different avenues that you could look at and with different pros and cons of each. But the real meat of the course is going over, how to find cars and how to decipher which ones are ones you should buy versus which ones aren't, how to find these below market value deals, how to negotiate the deal, how to maintain your fleet and really address that, whether it's outsourcing it or doing it in-house, how to make your fleet just as passive as possible. So taking out those redundant tasks, trying to make it as really effortless, though it's always going to take effort, but really how to take those really tough, repetitive tasks out of the question to make it as passive as you can. And I like to say that it's semi-passive, which I think is still the case even at my husband and I's level. And going over things like how to keep track of your accounting, how to handle damage claims, how if you have a damage claim, how can you make sure that you end up ahead? It really is a super in-depth guide on how to do it. And we update it quite frequently, with the most recent update just about a month ago. And then whenever people join, they also get access to our private Discord group. And so either myself or my husband, we try to be in there every day. And then we also do monthly Zoom calls as well. And so we the day that we're recording this interview with you guys, we have a Discord call later this evening where course members will go in, we'll do a Zoom call, and we'll answer questions, just get to know each other. And it's a real, sense of community with it.
So tell us just really quickly as we wrap up here, we got to hear your success within this, but since you've had 1,000 people take your course, I'm interested in maybe just one success story or two success stories you can point to. So somebody can say, well, maybe Aubrey's just the unicorn in this deal. By the way, unicorns in our conversations are usually bad because Joey owns a drop shipping site called 100 Unicorns, and it sucks. It doesn't make any money. It's kind of like the Turo business that I started. But for other people, I'm interested to say, like, hey, are there other people having success just like Aubrey?
Oh, 100%. So in our course community, I think we have one person that might have close to our car count of my husband and I, so kind of like the 25 to 30 mark. But we have a ton that have over a dozen. And so people who've, purchased the course in the last few years, we actually did an update on the course back in August of 2023. And so we've seen quite a large influx in the last 6 to 8 months. And we've seen a lot of people who in that period of time have gone from 0 to 10 cars. And so quite a lot that have actually grown their fleet, but even more who've come to us and said, like, hey, because of you, I was actually able to make money off of this damage claim, or because of you, I didn't lose my shirt whenever this car was totaled. And so I think there's a lot of different ways to measure success. Of course, car count is definitely one of them. And we've seen a lot of success with people growing their fleets. But then there's also that, people saying, hey, you've prevented me from losing money or making a large mistake. And that was because of the course. And we get those types of messages and commentary from members quite frequently, like multiple times per week.
So you probably would have advised somebody not to buy a 1.5-year-old Audi convertible, for instance, as a potential car sharing opportunity.
Yes, I would definitely advise against it. In fact, Audis are on our blacklist. And so we do not buy Audis. My husband used to work at an Audi dealership.
Oh, good. That's great. The good thing that I don't have it on Turo. My daughter drives it now. It was a great deal for her. It's like, this is not going to work. And I don't know what to do with it because if I go to resell it, I'm going to lose 10 grand. Here, you drive it. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, Aubrey, for being on here. I'm super excited for people who are interested in the car sharing platform to go. If you're interested in this, go to what'swhatwallstreet.com/cars, and you can find out more all about Aubrey. She also has an amazing YouTube channel. It's like 130 something thousand followers. So she's got content, obviously, not only Joey and I are interested in. I think you'll find value by going there as well. Thank you so much, Aubrey, for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
as always, Tribe, if you found value in this, take time to just screenshot this. Like, this is sort of stuff that may be unique to you that you're interested in. Tag Joey and I on social if you can find us. And we'd love to keep making content just like this for you. Have an amazing day.
This has been the Wealth Without Wall Street podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the show to break free of the Wall Street mindset and begin building wealth on your own terms in places you understand so that your wealth will never run dry. See you next episode.